Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 133 of the longest tenured Denver Nuggets spin-off podcast in the world. Welcome to the DNVR Nuggets' Serbian Corner. My name is Miroslav Čuk, and before we begin, please let me remind you to like the video on YouTube, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the DNVR Sports YouTube channel and DNVR Nuggets podcast channel. The audio version is perfect for your commute or to make your office/home office time more bearable. If you want to support the show more directly, you can become a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/MiroslavCuk, just like my Sicko tier supporters, Peter Plummer and Daniel Lynch. By the way, I'd like to shout out my newest Patreon, Jason Ryman. Welcome to the family, Jason. Let's recap the two games that happened since my last show. So first, the Sacramento game. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a defensive play called Hack-a-Shack, where a team would have three centers with 6 fouls each, who were fouling Shaquille O'Neal and taking advantage of his bad free throw shooting. In today's NBA, we have Nikola Jokić, and since he is a good free throw shooter, Hack-a-Jokić is a defensive play where players hack him senselessly and not get called for fouls because refs like Ed Malloy exists. That is basically what happened in the Sacramento game. Nikola scored all of his 22 points through triple teams, picking the situations when his wide open teammates didn't look shot ready. Luckily, Jamal Murray was ready to foul bait like he never baited before. As Jack Donaghy would say, he was a master baiter. Russ was also super ready to compete. Christian was his usual awesome self. And Michael Porter found a way to contribute despite another horrible shooting night. In a high-calorie fourth quarter, Denver had just a bit more ammo than the Kings, so they won in this exhausting game. Oh, and Zeke was great off the bench, defending like a madman and hitting timely shots. Lastly, last night, Suns game. I had a perfect experience with this game. The start time for me was at 4 a.m. So I said, F that, I'm not getting up for the lousy Suns. That is why I woke up at 6:30 a.m. expecting to see the final score. Denver was up 3 with 1.4 seconds to go, and they conceded a 3 that somehow got in time, even with 2 passes. My whole live experience was the overtime, and that was 5 minutes of perfect basketball against a team that isn't won. The Nuggets had 24 points in those 5 minutes, and all 5 guys scored while shooting 8 of 9 from the field and 7 of 7 from the line. Joker somehow had 5 assists in the overtime alone. Anyway, I proceeded to watch the DNVR Sport post-game show and was blown away by how depressed my buddy D-Line was after this game. And he was right. The Nuggets started the game by making 7 threes in the first quarter. Gordon was 4 of 4 in that period. Gordon continued with great shooting by making a total of 7 threes in 10 attempts. Christian Brown was 4 of 5 from the outside. Peyton Watson and Joker had 3 threes apiece. And yet somehow the Nuggets didn't blow the Suns out, even though they had an 11-point lead going into the fourth. That lead didn't melt quickly because the Nuggets were scoring, but they didn't even try to play defense in that period. Anyway, Christian Brown made a 1.4 seconds before the end of regulation to put them up 3, and I already described what happened after that. Let me see if I have any other notes. Oh, yeah, Joker had the first 30-20-20 game in league history. It's what he does. Okay, my guest for today is a frequent star character on this show, something like Ted Danson in Curb Your Enthusiasm. Let's just hope he doesn't run away with my wife by the end of it. He's been covering the NBA League at large for the Bleacher Report since forever. I've been listening to his delightful podcast called Hardwood Knocks since the time of iPhone 10. Calling from New York, New York, it's Dan Favale. Dan Favale. Welcome back to the show.
What's going on, Miroslav? How you doing?
Pretty good. Well, actually, I've had a pretty exciting day on X, former Twitter. I had a pretty a controversial tweet about the MVP race. I was actually not tweeting about the MVP race until today at all. I was holding my horses. I didn't want to go into that too soon. And after last night's performance by Joker, I just had to say what I had in my heart, and that is that SGA is probably going to win the MVP award this season, and that's because of the way the MVP voters look at stuff. And I even have the little metric I made that should emulate how the MVP voters think about the MVP voting. So it's not the basketball references percentage of chance of winning the MVP, because that one is based on solid proof in numbers. This one is more made on like how would a guy like Stephen A. Smith or Mad Dog or somebody like that vote in an MVP race. And in that metric, SGA also has the significant, I would say, lead in the MVP race. But what I said today was, yeah, one day our kids are going to see that we voted SGA despite Joker having this season, and they were just going to think we were stupid. And that's, no, mind me, I said that because the kids in 20 years will not have the context in which this MVP race is going on. And now I'm putting you on the spot and telling me, was I too harsh with my wording?
Yeah, I think you were. I think regardless of whether you have Jokic or Shea right now, I think that it could be an either or proposition. And even if Shea wins and you think that it should have been Jokic, I think you look at how important he is to one of the two best teams in the NBA. You look at him being an active participant in one of the greatest defenses in NBA history. That's a deserving MVP. I would agree with the sentiment that I think he'll win it and that people will subconsciously gravitate towards Nikola Jokic has 3, Shea has 0, and that will impact the race more than it absolutely should. I just don't think that should factor in at all. But I think that as people right now try to, can Giannis sneak in there or something? I think that pretty clearly Shea would be a deserving MVP winner if he does win it. I don't think it would be an egregious pick by any stretch.
My internet got broken for a moment. I'm sorry. So you mentioned that Shea, of course, would be a deserving MVP, and I agree with that sentiment. I already said that when you have all the context available to you, of course, SGA's numbers are not closely as impressive as Nikola Jokic's, but when you look at the number of wins the Thunder have, and the fact that he is basically the only top level playmaker on that team, and that team probably wouldn't be very good in the long term without him, that's also a good case for SGA.
Yeah, they both have incredibly compelling cases, and I think that Twitter is not really the place for nuance anyway to have that type of discussion. But I would disagree that if we look back on this in 10 or 20 years, assuming any records of what happened still exist at that point, I would say that it would be pretty easy to say, okay, maybe you think that Jokic could have won it, but I don't think it'll be like a Russell Westbrook OKC Thunder situation. And part of that, you mentioned wins. I think those matter for sure, especially when you're someone who's driving those wins. But this isn't a case of that Thunder team. I think was like 6th in the West or whatever it was, and so the OKC is going to be 1st in the West and maybe have the best record in the league when all said and done.
You mentioned to me before the show that you didn't catch the game last night between the Nuggets and the Suns. But what did you think when you saw the box score and Joker with 31, 21, 22, and 3 steals?
Yeah, I mean, I had a ton of messages about the game, and then I went back and watched like a bunch of Joker's possessions, and he's otherworldly. I mean, you know how I feel about Nikola Jokić. He's preternatural, and I think some of the passes were just almost mean because of the way that like Phoenix was defending him, was just inviting it. But he is so good, and this is just the stat lines he is capable of putting up, and the way that I would say all these years later that he can sort of shape shift who he needs to be, like where it's just nights where, and I feel like we saw a bunch of different versions of Jokić just based off the possessions that I was watching. But like sometimes it doesn't feel like he's enough of a scorer, but if he knows that he needs to be, like, so would you rule out that he's just going to have a 50-20-20 game? I just wouldn't, because like that's the type of player that he is. So this dude, he's just insane. Like that's the only word to describe him. He's insane.
The shape shifting you mentioned, I was thinking about it earlier today when I see all the discord on why he shouldn't be the MVP. Like he doesn't have the most points per game, which is, one of the ways you can look at it. And I was thinking, like, what if he, just for fun of it, would average like 35 points per game next year? Like he could easily do that if he would put his mind into it.
Yeah, I think he could. And also there was a point this season, not necessarily recently, but where it looked like he would have a chance to win the scoring title in addition to leading the league in assists and rebounds. And so using points per game as like anything other than this is what this guy is doing, but to use that as just, oh, this is why Shai deserves MVP. It's honestly a discredit to Shai because he just does so much more than put up the scoring numbers.
Yeah, it's unfair to, I mean, here's the thing. In EuroLeague or in any kind of FIBA competition, you decide who is the best player by looking at the numbers, and you have a number similar to like a PER in the NBA, and whoever has the biggest one, he's just going to be the best player, especially if that player is playing on a team that won it all in the competition. And the NBA doesn't want to do that because they want to drive the narratives. They want to drive all the discussion because it generates so many clicks for everybody involved. So not having clear way to decide who the MVP is actually the point of the award, I think.
I mean, it is. And they also used to, and I did not know this, we just did our Commissioner for a Day podcast over at Harwood Knox, and someone submitted a rule change. They said, I want to bring back the IBM award, which is this award the NBA had for almost 2 decades where a formula concocted by the company IBM determined who won this award. And so we went back and we looked at all the winners, and like they kind of line up with like Charles Barkley won it a bunch, David Robinson won it a bunch. But I think that if you did something like that here, there's already people who think that the NBA is uncomfortably skewed towards metrics or making things not open enough for interpretation. Like they think that numbers killed the game, which I disagree with. But I think if you boil it down to that, it might make the discussion more cut and dry, but then the criticism is going to shift from why people think so-and-so is MVP to the criteria that determines it.
Yeah. And I would imagine that's something that happened in the 80s. So they probably needed like a supercomputer back then to just calculate all the stats. The supercomputers were not
like an entire city in Georgia or something. Like the supercomputer was just stationed there. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, they would have some cards with holes in it, and they would put it in.
Yeah,
it would make the calculation. And no screen, no nothing. Yeah,
I had no idea that award existed. It was before I was super young when it ended, but like I don't remember, and like maybe that's part of the problem. Like I don't remember that David Robinson was a 6-time IBM award winner or whatever, how many times he won it. But I think he owns. We went through it. Dave, for anyone who cares, David Robinson is the all-time leader in IBM awards. Shout out to him.
He's my first favorite superstar, so I'm really happy about it. I actually remember the name, the IBM award. I did not remember who was winning it back in the day. So that's a nice piece of trivia I'm going to dive in the next couple of days. Okay, let's take our first break, and after that, we're going to talk a bit about Calvin Booth. Don't go anywhere. Okay, we're back. So Dan, I'm not going to be very polite on this show. You murdered Calvin Booth last summer for the moves he did and didn't make in the offseason. How do you assess letting KCP walk, salary dumping Reggie Jackson, losing 3 second-round picks in the process, and signing Russell Westbrook and Dario Saric today?
Ends up being a mixed bag, I would say. Russell Westbrook felt pretty innocuous, even if you weren't a fan of it, just because he cost the minimum. He's definitely been better than I would have expected. With regards to Saric, that was just a terrible move, as was the Reggie Jackson thing. And you could have had extra second-round picks that you could now potentially use to get off of Dario Saric this summer because he has that player option. Letting KCP walk is interesting because he's not having a good offensive year in Orlando. He's just not hitting his threes as much as he was last year. But what I will say is that if you go and look at his shot quality in Orlando versus what it was in Denver, like that is the difference. And so there's kind of two ways to look at it. It lends support that are most people around Nikola Jokić replaceable because of the quality of shots that he generates? The answer is probably yes. But I still think when you look at their defense and where it feels like, I know they've missed Aaron Gordon a bunch this year, but they feel better suited to, in like kind of one-on-one situations or singular assignments, they have the personnel, the range to do a bunch of stuff. But when you're kind of throwing more complications in there, screen navigation, for instance, he could have really still helped them there. And so it's still a move that I would have just kept him. And then if you like wanted to duck the second apron, I would have figured out the rest later. With that being said, I don't think enough of us, myself included, like kind of understood how punitive that the second apron was going to be, is that we looked at it through the lens of, oh, it's just expensive. Ownership doesn't want to pay it, which for the record, true. But the restrictions it puts on your team building and then risking like having your draft picks like frozen, or so like that is a real threat. And we've seen other teams kind of follow, like be wary of it in the way that the Nuggets did. My biggest criticism would still be, though, you sold KCP walking, you sold what happened over the offseason as this is flexibility for us. And then you proceeded to do absolutely nothing with that quote unquote flexibility midseason. So it's still a mixed bag, probably a better mixed bag than I would have said at the time. But I don't know that anything he did or what they didn't do, like I still think KCP would have been a useful player for this team on the defensive end specifically. And I bet that his efficiency on the offensive end would be much higher than it is in our, like, it's the quality of his 3 points specifically. I think he was like in the 69th percentile or something of 3-point shot quality last year. That thing's all the way in like the 30s now because Orlando doesn't make threes. They don't set up good threes. The spacing's awful. So I understand it probably more now. Like I said, that we're in the second apron era a little bit more. But you don't get to like peddle it as like, well, this is going to give us more team building flexibility and then proceed to do absolutely nothing productive with that quote unquote flexibility.
We'll talk more about the second apron stuff in, I guess, our third segment today. But before that, you mentioned KCP walking. My biggest thing about that was the Nuggets had 7.5 guys playing in their playoff rotation back in 2023 when they won the championship with Bruce Brown and Jeff Green and Christian Brown coming off the bench. Christian didn't play in all of the games. So this is why I say 7.5. And then they lose Bruce Brown. They get down to 6.5. Then they lose KCP. That's okay. It's no longer 5.5 because Christian Brown is a real asset. You can call him a real starter now, but he was just backed up by Julian Strother this season and not by KCP. Like KCP might have been demoted to the second unit, but he would still be KCP. He would still be a really good defender who can hit well-made threes. So this is the reason why I was really low on that move. And by the way, that mentioned flexibility was a real thing until they lost all of their second-round picks in the Reggie Jackson deal. So they had no sweeteners at all to do some kind of deal. And you might say, yeah, but maybe next summer they could do something when there's like that 2031 first-round pick who can now get protection on it because it's not that far away as it was during this trade deadline. But then you also can see that the Nuggets have 13 guarantees contracts for next year. So there's not a lot of room to add new people there. But I digress too much. Tell me, Dan, the Nuggets are right now 41-22 at the third quarter mark of this season, sitting at the third seed in the West. You know, despite losing a starter from last season and missing Aaron Gordon, Russell Westbrook, Jamal Murray, Peyton Watson, and even Nikola Jokić for multiple games since October. How would you grade their season so far? Would you say they did more or less than what you would have expected from them?
Probably slightly more, just because my expectations were lower after the offseason they had. I think in net, if you want to the Nuggets aren't. I look at it through like the Knicks are this new entrant to the title discussion. The Nuggets are not, and so in essence, they're right where they should be. And I think that ever since what is it, December 8th, when they're like 38-10 or whatever ridiculous, like ever since they were 11-10, they have the second best offense in the league. I think relative to some of the injuries they've suffered, you could say that they've slightly overachieved, but overall, just the roster they built and where they're supposed to be when you have Nikola Jokić, and if you view Jamal Murray as who you paid him to be, they're right where they should be, which is good. And I think that for them, this is kind of a tired trope, but it does really still come back to the defense. Were they 21st during this stretch in points allowed per possession? Something during this stretch that is a little bit like eye-popping is they're dead last in points allowed per possession against top 10 teams, and that's a situation they've struggled in a bunch. I mentioned at the top, I think they have the personnel to do some nice things individually defensively, but they probably need better team defenders, and I think that's where that's something that Zeke Naji has helped them with too. Is like someone who could slide his feet or just like pick up a rotation just as a help guy. So I'll be interested to see what it looks like for them in the playoffs. And as you mentioned, like I think missing Peyton Watson, him missing time big, but like Aaron Gordon missing any time at all is just monstrous for this team. And so to be sort of like, I would say outside, like close to outside the bottom 10 in defense might be like meeting expectations, but that is the side of the ball that they feel very matchup dependent heading into the playoffs, where if you think that they're just going to flip this defensive switch and be really good, I think that is probably a little bit more matchup dependent when you're looking at the teams than that. But like I said, they do have a bunch of individual talent. And I think that like even Jalen Pickett's had some really nice defensive moments. And so like if depending on what the rotation looks like in the playoffs, maybe they do have a higher ceiling than what we've seen so far against the cream of the crop in the NBA.
The defense is a very valid point. I believe there's that stat that in the last 20-25 years, like 24 of 25 teams that won a championship were top 10 in defense, something like maybe 23 of 25. Well, one of the teams that wasn't were the 2023 Denver Nuggets were like 14th, I want to say, in defense that year, and they still pulled it off. Now, I'm not saying 14th is the same as like 23rd or whatever they are right now, but they just lost Julian Strother to the injury. He's going to be re-evaluated in 4 weeks, which probably means he's going to miss like 2 months, which probably means we're not going to see him by the end of this season. I mean, who knows? Something might happen, but I'm not very optimistic about him returning. But on the other hand, the Nuggets now introduce only good defenders off the bench. I'm not saying they're going to jump in defense significantly now, but they just have no choice but to play defenders because they have no more offensive-minded guys on their bench. And last night we saw for the first time, I believe, Peyton Watson playing at the 2, which is an idea I've had for a long time because he is really mobile. He can at least on defense, play that role really well. We saw the jumbo lineup of Russell Westbrook, Peyton Watson, Michael Porter, Aaron Gordon, and I believe Nikola Jokić, and at some point Zeke Naji too. So that's a really long lineup. Do you think there's any chance for them to jump into like top half of defenses before the end of the season by virtue of just playing defenders off the bench?
I guess it's certainly possible. I mean, the margins are pretty slim. So if they're 21st with a 115.7 defensive rating, getting to league average would be about finishing the season with 115. Do I think that you mentioned the 2023 season. I think they were 17th in points allowed per possession that year. They ended up being 5th in the playoffs. So this might be a team that, and look, they've been a lot of the times, it feels like they're a lot better when they're able to get their defense set, as opposed to like some of the transition numbers on them are pretty just egregious. So like that is something too. If you're going to go jumbo as well, I think that could help you there. So, and like that was part of their intrigue in 2023 was that they were this monstrous team. So, I mean, trying Peyton Watson at the 2, I hadn't thought of that. I guess I hadn't heard you say it either, but that's definitely something that I guess would be worth a look. And you're right, like with the injury to Strother, and then I think like even if he's healthy and you're kind of looking at the makeup of this team, I don't know that you even have like the shooting talent necessary to say like, well, we shouldn't just lean all the way into defense. And like Nikola Jokić and even Jamal Murray, like they're going to figure it out within the tightest of spaces. And so you should prioritize what you're going to look like defensively. And again, I've liked a lot of what Zeke Naji's been able to provide them on the perimeter, how he's been able to recover and contest shots, and just, you know, some of the guys that he's been able to defend. And then having just someone like a Peyton Watson, who's like someone who can, as you mentioned, he's mobile, and I think there could be times where he might be overmatched against some of the stronger guys, but that's someone you can absolutely, I mean, we saw him on Kevin Durant a little bit, like from the footage that I'm watching of that game. We've seen him on Kevin Durant previously in this season. So, like I said, they have a lot of individual defensive talent. I just don't think it's like translated. How much of that is injuries because of Watson, because of Gordon, those two names specifically, we'll have to see, because of not playing Zeke Naji. And like now they know that, okay, like this is more of a perimeter defender. We're not going to try and use him in like that for the most part, in that, you know, traditional, not semi-traditional big man's role on the defensive end. And so now you've put him in maybe his optimal position. So to answer your question a long-winded way, I think their ceiling on defense is higher than we've seen thus far this year. I would be curious to see. I still think the jury's out on whether is their postseason defensive ceiling as high as it was in 2023 when they were one of like the 4 or 5 best defenses during that entire run.
That's very fair. One a sentiment we have this season is we are waiting for the Nuggets to show us their best face we haven't seen so far. I asked my guest this on the last show. Do you think at one point it just gets too late to expect something we haven't seen in the first let's call it 63 games, and just expect without any changes to the roster to expect a significant jump when it comes to the tier of contending for the championship compared to what we've seen so far? And you mentioned all the bad data against good defenses, against good teams. The Nuggets have literally like three wins against really good teams so far this season.
That's a really good question. I think it's probably unfair to expect there to be a wholesale change, but when you're dealing with a core that's shown they can kind of do it before, like the bones of that championship team are just still here with Jamal Murray, Michael Porter Jr., Jokić, Aaron Gordon. And like I said, they have the built-in excuse of, okay, like, do we have our best optimal defensive rotation available all the time or close to it? Like, they just probably haven't, just the sheer amount of time that Aaron Gordon has missed. And I think what's also important context is you seldom have someone like an emergence. If this keeps up, let's see if it keeps up. Like, what are we seeing from Zeke Naji right now? Is this someone who's going to hit threes, can maybe give you some spot minutes at the 5, does a lot of defensive stuff at the perimeter? Is that going to hold through the end of the season? So I think it would be unfair to expect some sort of monster defensive turnaround from this team, but I would say the door to it feels more open than in other situations, because I think if you dig into the context, most notably of the emergence of Naji and like having Aaron Gordon healthy for now anyway, that those are things that absolutely matter.
Okay. I have only one more micro Nuggets team for you, but we're gonna talk about it on the other side of this break. Don't go anywhere. Okay, we are back. So Jamal Murray is easily the most volatile regular season player in the league. We joke that he is very consistent in his inconsistency, having incredibly different month-by-month splits throughout his career. The Nuggets survived the first 2.5 months of this season thanks to Russell Westbrook, Nikola Jokić two-man game, while Jamal was ramping up very slowly. But since New Year, he has had many more great than underwhelming games. But even with him playing much better, the Nuggets didn't go straight back to the heavy Murray-Jokić pick-and-roll game plan like last season. Do you think that's by design? And how do you feel about Jamal's season so far?
I would probably maybe hope. I don't know if that's by design, but I think that his season is. I know they've kind of talked about a turnaround more recently, but like during this mega stretch from the Nuggets since December 8th, like he's hitting over 40% of his threes. He's been just more consistent in general. I think that his season has been like fine. I think that everyone's kind of not everyone maybe who's watching the Nuggets on a day-to-day basis, but the national media has just kind of tethered itself to this early season impression of Jamal Murray. Like that still kind of exists there. And the fact that he's come on over like what 2+ months at this point. Yeah, the volatility is still there. That's always been there, but this is also someone who has hit some of the biggest shots, had some of the biggest games in recent postseason memory. So I think if you're the Nuggets, you have to be feeling pretty darn good about where Jamal Murray's at right now. If you're looking and trying to scale ahead to the playoffs.
Last night against the Suns, I mentioned the perfect game from the Nuggets, scoring 24 points in 5 minutes on like 90% from the field. And Jamal just hit two tough shots like they were nothing. And granted, the Suns looked like they didn't want to be on the court, like they were pissed that they had to play 5 extra minutes with each other. But I might be going too far in that direction. But he was almost invisible for the big part of the game. And then he was really good in the fourth quarter and in the overtime, and together with all the other guys. I'm really liking what I'm seeing from him right now, and I can just hope for his good health in the next 2 or 3 months, for as long as the Nuggets postseason is going to last, because I have a feeling that at least on the offensive side of the ball, he will do his part. In the last couple of games, maybe not couple of games, but I remember the Boston game. The Nuggets did lose that game, but he was constantly attacked by Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown in isolation because they thought that they would deal with him easily, and they did score some on him, but they also had some pretty dumb turnaround jumpers because they couldn't get enough, separation from him. Did you notice any improvement on the defensive end from him recently?
I think that that's just another part of his game that feels inconsistent. I think what really helps him is that when he's engaged, he has really good positional size. If you're going up against a Jason Tatum or a Jaylen Brown, that's not going to matter as much because those are guys that can shoot up over the top of him. But I think that when you kind of look at how strong that he can be when he's fully healthy, that's someone who can be like, okay, he's navigating some screens for us in the half court. And I think that he's a smarter defender than he gets credit for when you're looking at stuff that can happen away from the ball, or if they do need to switch, if he needs to help. So I go back and forth because I do think that he was really good, unless I'm just kind of misremembering at this point. Like in 2023, trying to remember back to that postseason, I thought he had some just absurdly high defensive moments. And so I don't know if he's like really on that type of trajectory, but this might be at this moment, is that like the healthiest that we've kind of seen him in, I guess, since those moments. So like that could end up being a big deal for sure. And I think with him, I mean, just to go back to the offense, 97th percentile in self-created shot making efficiency this year. And that's like pretty routine for him. That's hugely valuable to you in the playoffs, especially when, if you look at, I think part of his offensive volatility sometimes can be, I know a big thing in Denver right now is kind of the Jokić rules with the way teams are defending him. But like what makes that possible is that the Nuggets at any given point can have 2-3 shooters on the court that defenses don't care about. And so you have to work within tight confines. Jamal Murray is somebody who can do that. And like we've seen kind of, okay, the 2-man game with Jokić can sometimes get bumped off, but if you need that guy to just go get like that down and dirty from scratch bucket when things fall apart, yeah, there's Jokić, but then there's Murray after that. And there's no one else on this team that's even going to come close to matching that. So I think when you're looking at, depending on how you feel about defense at the specifically like the primary guard position, I think Murray at his peak is decidedly above average there. I don't know that he's never been someone though that I viewed as like, oh, can he guard up a ton to where there might be some two guards if you consider Jaylen Brown a two guard that he would struggle against. And then certainly like you're not going to want to see him in situations where he has to scale up to wings or power wings.
Yeah, you remember how ecstatic I was during the 2023 playoffs when I asked you, is Jamal Murray now a top 10 player in the league? Because he was playing like one in that playoff run. But yeah, of course, all the other stuff matters as well when we are trying to do those kind of ratings. Now, you mentioned the owners not being too happy about going over the second apron. And I do have a question about that for you. The NBA owners have actually run from the second apron like it's plague, and only the Celtics, Suns, and Timberwolves were brave enough to go over it, right? None other team. Even
Is
though
brave the right word for the Suns?
yeah, well, I love their bravery, by the way. Like Matt Ishbia is my favorite NBA owner, and I hope he will stay the owner of the Suns for many years to come because I'm a hater. But even the Minnesota Timberwolves salary dumped Karl Anthony Towns so they could get out of the second apron easier next summer, I guess. Maybe not, we'll see. How do you feel about the future of 3 max contracts teams, and more specifically about the trio of Jokić, Murray, and Porter going forward in the surrounding of the new CBA?
I think if you're gonna have 3 max guys on your roster, there's probably 2 factors for it that needs one of 2 things needs to happen for it to really work. One, if not 2 of those guys, needs to be on like the fun max, as Brian Windhorst calls it, like coming off the rookie scale, sort of like Cleveland right now with Mobley and Garland. That, or, and Cleveland would also be a good example of this. They're just, the players happen to fit on their rookie. They hit both these boxes. They need to be in the dead heart of their primes, because if you have someone, Durant's older, but like him and Booker's not been his best this season, but like still really good. But if you have someone with Bradley Beal who feels like he's on this precipitous decline, or he doesn't scale to a smaller role as well, it becomes wildly problematic, because not only is your roster shallow to begin with, but now in future seasons, it becomes hard to flesh it out with capable players because you're dealing with such restrictive like transaction options. You're basically, especially if you're out of assets, but even if you're not, like the kind of 1-for-1 trades when it comes to like can't aggregate, can't take back more money than you send out, like that stuff makes trades difficult. And then the fact that you can't do anything other than add players on a minimum contract in free agency. So when you look at the Nuggets, I do think, I was talking about this the other day because we were speaking on, we were doing something on which teams could look the most different next year. And a lot of people kind of want to know, like, well, isn't there a ton at stake for Denver? And I think when you're at this level, there's always a ton at stake. It's implicit. You have Nikola Jokić, and you're coming off a disappointing end to last year, and you are getting expensive. But they do have a wiggle room. Like if they want to, they can keep this exact team together. They'll be comfortably under the second apron. They might have some wiggle room under the first if they're able to, dump a Dario Saric somehow just because he's an expiring. Who knows? Zeke Naji might just have trade value after this season, for all we know. Some people thought that was one of the worst deals in the league. I do think we're going to reach a point where I would throw even Aaron Gordon into there. Like probably one or two of those 3 guys, because Jokić shouldn't go anywhere. They're not going to be on this roster moving forward. And I think that right now, like you don't have a clear pathway to replacing the peak version of Jamal Murray. So I know people look at that contract and say, meh, like we've kind of seen Jamal Murray's pinnacle more often lately. They need him. And so I look at Michael Porter Jr., and I know they did pay Aaron Gordon, but like those guys are going to be inflection points for how deep into the aprons or how restrictive they're going to be willing to go. And so I think that if anything does happen with this team, barring just an absolute playoff flop where they get, let's say they lose in the first round or get trucked in the second round or something, I think that they have time to where nothing should happen before next year's deadline, if not more likely the following offseason. But I wouldn't even guess, especially when you have Christian Brown and Peyton Watson's deals coming down the pipeline. Both are extension eligible this summer. Like there's going to be changes. I don't want to pinpoint necessarily. They might decide that do we want to foot the bill for Peyton Watson moving forward based off how many minutes he's playing and what he might cost to retain? So like those, like Christian Brown, Watson, Gordon, and Michael Porter Jr. specifically are probably just names to keep an eye on over the next 2 years, because I won't say they won't do it, but if you're going to go into the second apron to keep this team together, you really would have needed to have hit like Christian Brown and Peyton Watson need to be even better than they are right now, just because you're going to have Gordon and even Murray and Michael Porter Jr. getting a little bit older if you want to keep the band together.
Next summer is definitely, or this upcoming summer is definitely going to be a very fascinated one because of those two extensions you mentioned, to Peyton Watson and Christian Brown. And it's mostly because the Nuggets are now finally in the position where they might just not offer those extensions at all and wait for the restricted free agency. Because, you know, the worst thing that could happen from that is to get a guy on a 3+1 deal instead of like a full 4-year or 5-year deal. Because, you know, Nikola Jokić in 4 years is going to be 34. So maybe that's not as pressing as it was when they were extending Jamal and Michael Porter for the first time.
The other thing here too, Miroslav, is that, and part of this has to do with the cap climate, but like NBA front offices have just become so cowardly over the past half decade or so, where we didn't have a single rival restricted free agent offer sheet go out because all the top guys are signing extensions, and then teams don't want to teams don't want to tie up cap space in players they don't think that they're going to get. And then even the summer before in 2023, I think Paul Reed was the only offer sheet, and like that's Paul Reed, and Danny Ainge did some voodoo like when Utah offered it to him. So I don't think the Nuggets would be wrong to pass, because worst case scenario, you mentioned the 3+1. Maybe worst case scenario is like, well, they look like max players and you have to pay them that money. And like, that's a really good problem to have because given how, like how selective, and that's like even too charitable a word, outside teams have been with the players they're giving offer sheets to, like if it happens to where they're actually generating a ton of outside interest, something has gone incredibly right for Denver. And you figure out the math later. You have until, I mean, you should probably stop trading all your second round picks moving forward so you have some sweeteners left for things, but you have until the end of the league year to figure out your tax situation before that comes due. So I was honestly surprised. Actually, I'm going to hijack this and ask you, what do you think, like there's potential like material roster change in the offing this summer for the Nuggets? Like, do you view it as playoff dependent at all? Do you think that it's coming no matter what? Or do you think it's like sort of a year or half year too early?
Oh, well, if the Nuggets flame out in like first or second round, there just have to be some sort of change. And it possibly wouldn't be a roster change at all. It could be a coaching or front office kind of change. Honestly, I'm not sure. But I don't think it would be acceptable to lose for 2 seasons in a row in the second round while you have prime Nikola Jokić on the team. But that's just me. I'm not Stan Kroenke. I'm not even Josh Kroenke. So I don't know how they feel about it. But I do think that kind of outcome would require some sort of change. And I mean, that sort of change would probably just be Michael Porter, or maybe, I don't know, maybe somebody would be willing to give a lot for Christian Brown or Peyton Watson, and that would be the way to pivot from the current core.
That would be interesting because they're both obviously cost controlled for another year. But if you just think that they're never going to exceed or the importance of any of the core guys that are in place, or if you just think that they're not going to be like their zeniths just aren't going to be as high as maybe you were hoping, or maybe it's just a timing thing, or we have to pay both of these guys. No, that's not happening. We're not going to pay both of them. I mean, this could be a case of, do both of them get extensions, but like only one of them's on the team when it actually kicks in, where it's like you move them kind of in the 2026 offseason on that new number. So yeah, the Malone thing's a good call out too. Like if you have a bad playoffs, I think my guess would be that Michael Malone is more so on the hot seat than Calvin Booth, but that would be one route you look at. I guess I just looked at this team and it would take, and I'm just not assuming they're going to have this absurdly bad playoff run. Like, I think it would take sort of a failure of epic proportions, not losing in game 7 of the semifinals to like if you lose to, you don't want to lose to a Memphis or a Houston necessarily, but like the West is still really good. So unless they just go in and get absolutely trucked, me personally, I was curious what your thoughts were. I would have just been surprised if there was any sort of major changes here.
Yeah, you mentioned Michael Malone being on a hot seat. If you would ask the Nuggets nation, and I mean like the diehards, not like the casual, normal kind of fans, but the really invested fans, and if you would make a poll on whether Michael Malone or Calvin Booth have a safer seat in the organization, it would be as divided as like Joker and SGA discussion. Like you would have 50% people saying that Michael Malone is safe and it's not even close, and the other ones are going to say Calvin Booth, because we have the disciples of both of those.
That's interesting. I would have thought that, just because obviously I'm not going to be as plugged into Nuggets fans as you, I would have just thought with Zeke Naji emerging and like Jalen Pickett getting minutes and Russell Westbrook for the most part kind of panning out. Let's see how useful he is in the playoffs. That it would have been there were, and with KCP again, I think he would have been better in Denver. But with KCP having the season that he's had in Orlando, I would have thought that Calvin Booth would have came out looking among Nuggets fans a lot better than he did this time, 5 months ago or whatever it was.
Yeah, I'm turning to that side, honestly. Like for me, it was enough to see Zeke playing really well and Jalen Pickett being a real backup point guard in the NBA to sway in that side. But we'll see. Who knows? Who knows what the next 2 or 3 months are gonna bring us. Okay, let's take the last short break, and after that we're gonna talk a bit more about the Western Conference at large. Don't go anywhere. Okay, last segment. So let's now take a long distance view of the Western Conference and try to figure out the Nuggets' place in it when it comes to playoff chances, to chances to get out of the West. This is how I think about it. So I've decided there can't be more than 6 very good teams in a conference. So I'm asking you to give me your top 6 teams in I guess finals equity from the Western Conference this year, and you can do it in whichever order you want, from 1 to 6 or from 6 to 1, whatever. You can even have a honorary mention if you want to.
I'll go from the top down because I feel like I'm still hashing out mentally the bottom of the order. OKC's 1 for me. There are people that have doubts about how their offense will translate to the playoffs. I think that's somewhat fair, but 2 things. SGA is going to play more minutes in the playoffs. And so like the non-SGA minutes, it's just like people say, and I agree, like why would the Nuggets ever invest like real equity in a backup 5 when Jokic is going to play at least 40 minutes per game in the playoffs? That's what the SGA is going to do. Now, and also the minutes without SGA, they've been a lot better when J-Dub gets to play with one of Chet or Hartenstein. We just haven't seen that a ton because both of those guys have been injured. And so I think some people, no one specific, are just overthinking Oklahoma City. They are the best team in the West to me. If it comes in the playoffs that their offense is somehow limited and that's what undoes them, we'll have that discussion. But they have shown there have been very little red flags with them. I'm just surprised. I saw that ESPN piece where people around the league aren't afraid of them. I don't buy into the BS of they just haven't done it before. People were saying that about the Nuggets in like 2000. Like it was at maybe a higher level by saying you can't win a title with Jokic because we saw him in the conference finals by that point. But like, come on. So they're 1. I actually have the Nuggets at 2. Which I'm surprised. I've had them at 2 for a while because he did this exercise at Harwood Knox like a month and a half ago. I was pretty like lower on them. Like at the beginning of the season, the vibes just felt like they were off. But they're 2 to me. I still, like I said, I have questions about the defense, what they've been able to do offensively, and knowing that they could be even better than we've seen so far, just as like the guys become more available. And if you even end up hitting on sort of one of these emergences where I tend to think that Russell Westbrook's not going to be very valuable to them in the playoffs, but like Zeke Naji might be, or maybe Jalen Pickett might be. And so if you're kind of hitting on like one of those fronts, that becomes a big deal for a rotation that looks like it could be kind of strapped in the playoffs post 2023, excuse me, specifically. 3rd, this is the one people are going to hate me for it. I think it's the Warriors, man. They, with Jimmy Butler there, it ups their lightning in a bottle potential. And the thing that has stood out to me, they are winning the minutes he plays without Steph Curry. Now, Steph Curry's going to play more in the playoffs. He's not going to play like, there's not someone you could run out for 42 minutes a game right now at his age. So having Jimmy Butler to kind of steward the offense, I wonder how it's going to work when Jonathan Kuminga comes back, just the spacing element of it all. However, they've had some really high defensive moments. Brandon Pajemski's playing a lot better since he dealt with that. I think it was an abdominal injury. They are small, but I think that their best lineup is Draymond Green at the 5 anyway. And I know that he's become not a punchline on Hardwood Knocks. He's like a cult favorite. Like Quentin Post is tall and like stretches the floor. He might matter for them. They got good minutes from Guy Santos. Buddy Hield is probably going to lose them a playoff game or two. But I look at the Warriors and like their ceiling feels materially different with now that Jimmy Butler's in the fold. So those are my top 3 if you would like to comment on them before we keep going.
Yeah, remember how everybody was high on Buddy Hield at the beginning of the season when he was shooting like 80% from the 3-point line on like 12 attempts per game? It was insanity. But that didn't last for long.
That man needs to find his way back to Indiana because I feel like that was the most stability he ever had as a performer. Because you look at, he's one of the most dead-eye shooters since he entered the league, but it's kind of like, we've talked about this before, where it feels like Michael Porter Jr. is one of the most inconsistent, best of all-time shooters in NBA history. And like Buddy Hield is kind of in that same vein.
Michael Porter is so funny because his misses look horrible and his makes look like butter. It's just amazing to watch.
Buddy Hield could be worse because even when Michael Porter Jr. is bad on defense, like he's still big. And like Buddy Hield is just, when Buddy Hield is bad on defense, it's like playing 4-on-5, basically. I do see in the chat, we have not seen Memphis or Houston yet. I think that they're both going to wind up being postseason duds. The offense there, like when you're looking, I don't think Memphis's half-court attack is wildly innovative. Jaren Jackson Jr. has improved a lot as a scorer. I just don't think that it's going to scale to the postseason. And Houston, their half-court offense doesn't scale right now. It's not going to, like Fred VanVleet is way too important to that team for them to, come out of the West for me. I do believe one of them will make the top 6, but I have to put the Lakers 4th.
Before we go to that, I have to ask you something because you mentioned the top 3 with Warriors being number 3. And I want to clip this. Does that mean then that Warriors getting Jimmy Butler is a bigger deal than the Lakers getting Luka? I'm just kidding.
Right. Yeah, it does. Like this. First of all, Luka's obviously not good, and he's going to be out of the league within the next 5 years. So I don't even know why we're spending time on this. Nico Harrison's a freaking genius.
Yeah.
So I have the Lakers 4th, and I don't want to put them there. I don't trust them. But I will say they have LeBron and they have Luka, which is just. Those are two, like no other team has 2 playoff assassins like them. Like even Jokic Murray might actually come closest when you're looking at just like because Shea doesn't really have that second playoff assassin. Boston, I mean, there's like Tatum and then Brown's a finals MVP, sure. So it's LeBron and Luka, but the thing that's just flooring me, and I keep waiting for it to turn, they have the league's best defense since the last time Anthony Davis played. So we're going back to the end of January since he was injured or wasn't playing when he got traded. So I'm waiting for it to stop. And then every time I watch them, they're frenetic as hell. Like they really get after it. And I think it's going to subside. Like their center rotation is just like, why is Trey Jameson doing things? And you have Jackson, like you need to be relying on Jackson Hayes. So I think the rug is going to be pulled out from underneath them a bit. But they run this like small ball unit where it's okay. Yeah, for a center, they're small, but the smallest player on the court's like 6'7". And so like they've been able to do some nasty things with that. And if you're going to get this level of health that Jared Vanderbilt's giving you right now in defensive activity, Gabe Vincent's been a little bit better. Austin Reeves has gotten like, I think people thought he was overrated. He might have sort of shifted to underrated now. Excuse me. So I have them 4th. Because they have Luka and LeBron, and apparently I know nothing about NBA defense because I would have been convinced that this team would have been terrible on defense after trading Christie and Anthony Davis.
There's plenty of things where Luka and Nikola Jokić are similar, and one of those is both of those guys can play really good defense when they really put their mind into it and put the energy into it. It's just that they usually don't have enough energy to spend on both sides of the court because of the huge load they have on offense. And LeBron James also plays really good individual defense and team defense, of course, when he really tries to. He was literally not trying on defense for like 3 months and started playing good defense like 2 weeks before Luka came to the team, I feel.
I'm
Coincidence, total coincidence.
Yeah, total coincidence. At 5, by the way, I would still go with Minnesota. I just can't quit them, and they're probably the single most inconsistent team in the NBA. But I think they've discovered some things with the way that Rob Dillingham has played, getting some nice minutes from Terrence Shannon Jr., so it gives them a little bit of alternatives if Mike Conley's not playing too well. I think Jaden McDaniels has gotten a little bit better offensively. He was cold to start, gets really hot, maybe cooled off a little bit now, but we saw what he was able to do offensively at times in the playoffs last year. And the Julius Randle of it all is tough, but I think that they just have, with Naz Reid and when Rudy Gobert is healthy, they have a bunch of different levers that they could pull. So I like their size and I guess their depth. I'm saying like even Nickeil Alexander-Walker's been really good this year. So how are they going to shorten that rotation? I think what's going to be really big for them is Chris Finch willing to go away from Mike Conley and or Julius Randle in the playoffs if that setup's not working? And what I mean by that is Julius Randle, this hasn't been his best season, but he hasn't been actually terrible. It's just the fit is so wonky at points, even sometimes with Rudy Gobert. So I think I think Chris Finch is going to have to be maybe more reactive than he's needed to be in the past with his rotation. They're just a team that is still their peak, because you just have to hit your peak in the playoffs. They seem pretty dangerous. And then I would have Memphis at 6. They're super deep. I worry about the 2 things I worry about with them. I already said they're half-court offense. I'm just curious to see how limited shooting with all that off-ball movement is going to kind of work in the postseason. And then their defense, Jalen Wells might win Rookie of the Year, but he's like overmatched when you need him to guard like these bigger wings. I think Vince Williams Jr. is going to be in that same boat. And then you're small. At like Vince Williams is only 6'4" himself. It's like Scottie Pippen Jr. He's really small. Is he going to run into some matchup problems if you try and play him? And then the Ja Morant shooting of it all. He's dealing with a shoulder issue too, and I think you can see it on some of his like shots. They're just so way off that how good is that shoulder going to be? But I still think they're a really good team. I just think that they kind of need like another dynamic wing to like really get over that hump. I think that would be my top 6 with an honorable mention to Houston, but this feels like the classic case of Orlando going to the playoffs last year. We kind of all had a sense of how they would lose, and then it was exactly how they lost when you look at what happened with their offense. I think that's what's going to wind up exposing them in the postseason. But I will say, and their defense has slipped a little bit, the way that they can play, like if Tari Eason, Amen Thompson, even Jabari Smith Jr. being healthy, like there's a lot of different things. Dylan Brooks, they can turn a lot of games into just like these. They're going to get out in transition and they're going to put you in the mud on offense, and the score might be fairly low. And maybe that's how they could win games. That's the team that was the hardest to place for me, but I need to see more dynamism out of their half-court offense, or at least more floor spacing out of it.
Thank you so much for this wonderful analysis of top 6 teams in your opinion. But that was just an exercise I made up, like top 6 teams. Where would you put the real cutoff of the teams that could actually get out of the West?
Out of the West?
Yeah.
I've probably, if I think any of the teams I mentioned, if you told me they got out of the West, maybe we cut it off at 5, because I feel like I'd still be a little bit like, I'd be surprised if anyone, to be honest, other than OKC, Denver, or Golden State came out of the West right now. But I have to recognize that maybe I've just like have a predetermined notion on the Lakers that I need to move on from. They've been really good. Minnesota's the tricky one for me, just because like if they hit their stride, like I think they could be really dangerous, but I do wonder if they lack the consistency for sure. Like when they play, if there was an award for playing down to the level of your opponent, I think they would probably win it this year. But offensively, I kind of wonder if they can cobble together enough just like constant higher end performances on that, like independent of Anthony Edwards. And if you're leaning on Rob Dillingham, what does it look like as a rookie in that situation? So let's be spicy and just say 4. I think the Lakers, the Warriors, the Nuggets, and the Thunder, with the Timberwolves as kind of the next closest honorable mention. I thought you were going to ask me how many teams do I think could win the title this year, which is just like,
I'm not even touching that because, man, at the moment I don't feel, because I'm watching the whole thing through the Nuggets lens, and I have no hope against Cleveland, and for some reason I have very little hope against New York, and Boston is still kind of a murky subject for me because I kind of feel that Boston has enough inconsistency in late game execution that I could see the Nuggets hanging on with them in 4 out of 7 games and winning all 4 clutch games against them. But that's it. Like it's too far away from me. We might meet again before the end of playoffs, so we could,
I think honestly, I think the true answer is just 5. I probably should throw the Lakers in there, but it feels like the Nuggets and most people should say 4. But like I think that the Warriors have something there, but the Nuggets, the Warriors, the Thunder, the Cavs, and the Celtics, there is not a single other title contender. I'm pretty bullish on my Eastern Conference stance, which is the Knicks. When Jalen Brunson is healthy, they could be a good team. And I know they're not the best matchup for the Nuggets. If the Nuggets make the finals, I am 110% sure that the Knicks will not be on the other side of it. So that should be good.
Yeah, that's the one. They cannot win against the Cavs or the Celtics. Dan, thank you so much for wasting part of your Saturday to chat with me today. Would you like to plug something before I let you go?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Go subscribe to Hardwood Knocks if you're not already. We cover the entire league, not just the Nuggets, but we do talk about the Nuggets quite a bit because the Nuggets are a pretty good basketball team. And thank you for having me, Miroslav.
Thank you so much. And that is all I've prepared for you this week, my dear listener. And please, with the cherry on top, take the word prepared very loosely. I've decided to award all my Patreons at patreon.com/MiroslavCuk with the link to ad-free version of this pod going forward. So if you missed the live show on YouTube, you will be able to find a link in the Patreon chat and enjoy the show without interruption. Be well, be safe, be kind to everybody. Call your mom, and until next week, Trail Lyles.